"Enjoy the company sweater and the gift card," she said, her nasal voice dripping with a smug confidence that suggested she had never once faced a consequence in her entire life. That was the moment I knew it was finally happening. Chloe, the chief culture officer and daughter of our chief executive officer, was firing me in front of all 62 employees during our quarterly all-hands meeting. There was no private conversation, no formal warning, and no written performance review. She chose to butcher my career right between the announcement of new kitchen coffee flavors and the slide showing our third-quarter cash burn rate. I stood near the back of the room, my arms folded across my chest, watching her struggle to read from a script that someone else had clearly written on her behalf. She cooed that I had been a valued member of the family, but due to performance misalignment and shifting cultural priorities, the leadership team had decided to part ways. Then she reached into a wooden crate on the table and pulled out a cheap polyester hoodie. My name was scribbled on the tag with a black marker. Tucked inside the hood was a $75 gift card to a juice bar that did not even have a location in my zip code. She added that because our fourth-quarter bonus rubric had been updated, my bonus would not be awarded. I could feel 62 pairs of eyes turning toward me in slow motion. The sales managers adjusted their collars, and the young interns stared at their phones, trying to look busy. The only person who avoided my gaze was Donald Jenkins, our chief financial officer, who looked like he wanted to dissolve into his chair. I just smiled. It was the quiet, calm smile of a professional who knows exactly what lies beneath the floorboards of the building. I accepted the scratchy polyester sweater, thanked everyone for the journey, and walked out without making a sound. They wanted a dramatic scene to share on company chat channels. But I gave them nothing but the quiet click of my shoes on the floor. Nobody in that room realized that our human resources representative, Rachel Higgins, had not asked me to sign a single piece of paper. There was no exit interview, no non-disclosure agreement, and no waiver of liability. Chloe had been trying to get rid of me ever since she was appointed to her position. She did not like my history with the firm, and she hated that the engineering teams trusted my guidance. When I had pointed out that $24,000 of our marketing budget had been spent on her private bachelorette weekend in Palm Springs, the human resources team told me to focus on positive company culture. Now I sat in my car, staring at the cheap hoodie in my passenger seat. I opened my personal computer, the one that had never been connected to the office network, and accessed a specific file. The document was titled Clause 12.7b Trigger. Chloe thought she had stripped me of my livelihood, but she had no idea that I held the key to the software platform she was planning to pitch to investors. I sat in my vehicle for a long time, watching the clouds pass over the glass office building. I remembered the early days of Vaxis Technologies when it was just Lawrence Miller and myself, working out of a dusty garage. I had built the initial infrastructure with my own hands, working late into the night while Lawrence handled the sales pitches. We had been partners, or so I had believed, until the company grew and the venture capital money started flowing. Once the corporate structure was established, Lawrence became distant and his daughter Chloe was brought in to oversee culture. She had no technical skills, no business experience, and no understanding of what it took to keep the servers running. Yet, she was given a massive salary and the authority to override my decisions. For the past year, I had watched her dismantle the processes I had spent years building. She replaced our engineering metrics with wellness surveys and renamed the developer teams to alignment squads. She spent thousands of dollars on custom office decorations, while refusing to approve budget increases for server maintenance. When I warned Lawrence that this approach would lead to operational instability, he told me that I was being rigid and needed to adapt to the new generation. He did not want to hear the truth. He only wanted to keep his daughter happy. I checked my personal computer again, verifying that the secure partition was fully encrypted. The file containing the clause was safe, backed up on a remote server in Iceland, and also saved on a small storage drive hidden in my home office. I had prepared this insurance policy months ago, knowing that my position was becoming increasingly vulnerable. I did not want to destroy the company, but I was not going to let Chloe walk away with my life work without a fight. The technical spine of Vaxis Technologies was not owned by the company. It was licensed from my personal business, Henderson Ops Systems LLC. The vendor agreement had been signed during a massive system consolidation last year, and the legal team had rubber-stamped it without reading the fine print. Clause 12.7b stated that if I was terminated without cause, the license would immediately revert to my LLC. It was a simple, elegant mechanism that required no lawsuit and no messy arbitration. The moment they pushed me out of the door, they lost the legal right to run their own product. I started the engine, backed out of my parking space, and drove away from the building. I was no longer an employee, and the clock was now ticking for Vaxis Technologies. To understand why I had built such a specific defense, you have to understand the nature of Vaxis Technologies. We were preparing for a $65 million funding round, and the investors were looking closely at our technology. Over the previous 8 months, I had worked to rebuild the entire back-end system, turning a chaotic mess of third-party tools into a single cohesive platform. I did this work through my private firm, Henderson Ops Systems LLC, which had been registered as an approved vendor for years. I drafted the agreements myself, and because our legal department was overwhelmed with contract reviews, they approved the terms without questioning the licensing clause. My attorney, Diane Vance, had helped me refine the language. Diane was 49 years old, with a sharp analytical mind, and a reputation for protecting her clients from corporate greed. We had met at a quiet tavern 4 weeks before my termination. She had reviewed the contract on my screen, sipping her drink and warning me about the risks of playing such a dangerous game with Lawrence. I told her that I had been acting like an owner while being treated like a disposable worker, and I needed protection. She nodded. Understanding that my work was the only thing keeping the company solvent, the clause was simple but devastating. It was titled Reversion of Use License upon Improper Termination. It specified that if the company terminated my services without a formal review process, documented performance issues, and a 90-day improvement plan, the licensing rights for the database architecture and integration APIs would revert to my LLC. It was a quiet bomb, hidden under pages of standard vendor terminology. Chloe was too busy planning her team retreats and recording social media videos to notice the details of our vendor agreements. She believed that software simply existed, like the air she breathed, and that anyone could be replaced with a cheaper contractor. She did not know that the entire database was tied to a license key registered to my LLC. I had simulated the trigger in a secure testing environment, verifying that the license would deactivate automatically once my payroll credentials were deleted. The compliance team, which was constantly understaffed, had logged the agreement into the system without secondary review, assuming it was just another standard integration contract. I drove home and parked in the driveway of my quiet suburban house. I walked up to the attic and placed a physical copy of the signed contract into my fireproof safe, alongside my personal documents and house deed. I felt a sense of relief as I closed the heavy steel door. For months, I had endured Chloe's constant microaggressions. She would leave me off important email threads, schedule meetings during my lunch hours, and take credit for my operational reports. During one executive meeting, she told the board that my focus on database security was a sign of a scarcity mindset. I had corrected her, pointing out that our customer data was vulnerable to exploitation, but Lawrence had simply nodded along with his daughter. Chloe wanted to replace me with a younger, more compliant manager who would not question her expenses. She did not realize that by pushing me out, she had activated the very mechanism that would bring her family business to a halt. I poured a glass of water and sat by the window, watching the rain start to fall. The silence of my house was a welcome contrast to the chaotic corporate environment I had left behind. In the days following my departure, I did not check my work email, nor did I look at the company message channels. I knew that Rachel Higgins would eventually send a digital exit package, but I had no intention of signing it. Any signature would only complicate my legal position, and since they had fired me without cause, I had no obligation to cooperate. My attorney had advised me to maintain complete silence. The engineering team would soon discover that they could not modify the core database schema without the administrative keys held by my LLC. The sales teams would continue to pitch the platform to prospective clients, unaware that the software was running on a revoked license. I spent my time working in my garden, reading books, and enjoying the quiet routine of retirement. I had spent 30 years building systems for other people, and for the first time, I owned the system that mattered most. I knew that Lawrence and Chloe would eventually realize what they had done, but by then, it would be too late to negotiate. This silence was my primary weapon. A less experienced employee would have sent angry messages or posted complaints online. I chose to disappear completely, leaving them to discover their own errors. My attorney had drafted a formal notification of license revocation, but we decided to hold it until the most critical moment. I watched the company website from afar, noting that they were still advertising the platform as fully functional. They were presenting our services to new clients as if nothing had changed, completely unaware that their backend was running on borrowed time. I spent my mornings drinking coffee and watching the birds in my yard, feeling a sense of peace that I had not experienced in years. I knew the storm was coming, and I was fully prepared. By the second week of my absence, the cracks in Vaxis Technologies were beginning to show. The company was in the middle of due diligence for the $65 million investment from Apex Ventures, and the analysts were asking detailed questions about our operations. Without my presence, there was no one to explain the complex routing of our customer data or the custom scripts I had written to prevent system failures. Our DevOps engineer, a young contractor Chloe had hired after meeting him at a weekend wellness retreat, tried to modify the back-end code to resolve a minor customer bug. The moment he attempted to commit the changes, the system blocked his access, displaying a licensing error. He did not know that the repository was configured to check for the validation token from Henderson Ops Systems LLC. He spent 3 days trying to bypass the security protocols, but the encryption was too robust for his limited experience. The system remained locked, and 3 critical customer microservices collapsed, halting all database updates for our largest corporate clients. Meanwhile, the finance department was facing its own crisis. The lead analyst from Apex Ventures had discovered a discrepancy of $1,800,000 in our projected revenue. They requested the historical audit logs to verify our billing calculations. Donald Jenkins, our chief financial officer, searched the server directories for the reporting tool I had built, but he could not find the executable file. I had removed the proprietary modules from the company's servers, as they were owned by my LLC and only licensed for my active tenure. Donald tried to recreate the calculations using spreadsheet software, but the formulas were too complex, and the results did not align with our official reports. He called Lawrence into his office, and the 2 men spent hours trying to resolve the discrepancy while the investors grew increasingly impatient. The deal was scheduled to close in 2 weeks, and Vaxis Technologies could not provide the basic financial documentation required to verify its assets. Chloe tried to manage the situation by launching a communication campaign. She posted a video on the company portal, calling the system issues a growth recalibration phase and encouraging the employees to remain focused on our cultural values. She distributed small, succulent plants to the engineering team and organized a mandatory group meditation session to reduce stress. The developers, however, were not reassured. They were working 18-hour days trying to rebuild the database schema from scratch, but they did not have the original documentation or the design specifications. One junior developer, whom I had mentored for 2 years, sent a message to my personal phone asking for help with the code. I read the message but did not reply. It was a difficult decision as I cared for the team, but I knew that any assistance would weaken my legal position. I had to let the system fail so that the board would understand the true cost of their nepotism. The operational chaos began to affect our clients. The customer support queue grew to over 400 tickets, and several key accounts threatened to terminate their contracts due to system downtime. The sales team could not run demos for new prospects because the staging environment was locked. The business was bleeding cash, and the quarterly burn rate was twice what had been projected. Chloe continued to assure the board that the issues were temporary and that the new culture initiatives would soon restore productivity. She seemed completely unaware that the technical foundation of the company was gone. Lawrence, however, was beginning to panic. He had invested his personal savings into the business, and the $65 million round was his only hope of recovering his investment. He began to call my phone, leaving voicemails asking for a meeting to discuss a consulting arrangement. I ignored the calls, allowing the voicemail box to fill up with his increasingly desperate messages. The developers tried to replicate the data pipelines, but they were met with encrypted files at every turn. The naming conventions I used were specific and required an administrative dictionary that only I possessed. The system was designed to protect client data, and without my specific authorization key, it was completely inaccessible. They attempted to restore the database from a previous backup, but the backup files were also protected by the licensing manager. The engineering lead realized that they were locked out of their own system, and they had no way to resolve the issue without my direct cooperation. The pressure was building, and the company was rapidly running out of options. The customer support team was overwhelmed by the volume of complaints. Customers were calling to report that they could not log into their accounts, and our support representatives had no information to provide. The managers tried to blame the issues on server maintenance, but the clients were not satisfied with this explanation. Several major clients threatened to leave the company if the system was not restored immediately. Lawrence spent his afternoons in his office, staring at the declining service metrics and wondering how they would survive the week. Chloe, meanwhile, was preparing her presentation for CE investors, convinced that she could win them over with her slide deck and corporate enthusiasm. She refused to acknowledge that the technical glitches were anything more than minor bumps in the road, and she repeatedly told her father that the developers were simply exaggerating the difficulty of the situation to demand higher salaries. It was exactly 2 weeks before the final presentation to Apex Ventures when my phone rang with an unfamiliar number. I was sitting on my patio, enjoying a cup of tea in the cool morning air. I decided to answer the call, suspecting it was the outside counsel for Vaxis Technologies. My suspicion was correct. The caller introduced himself as Alan Brewster, a senior partner at the firm representing Lawrence's company. His voice was stiff and formal, but I could hear the underlying tension as he spoke. He asked if I would be open to an informal discussion regarding some urgent vendor matters, offering a generous consulting rate for a few hours of my time. He claimed that the company simply needed some guidance on historical database configurations and that they wanted to maintain a positive relationship with me. I listened to his pitch, smiling quietly as I took a sip of my tea. I told him that I appreciated his call, but I was not available for any informal consulting work. Alan Brewster paused, clearing his throat before continuing in a more serious tone. He admitted that the engineering team was having difficulty accessing certain database modules and that the investors were asking for the documentation. He hinted that my refusal to cooperate could be viewed as a breach of my duty to the company, and that the board might explore legal options if the deal was compromised. I told him that my relationship with the company had been terminated by Chloe, and that I no longer had any obligations to Vaxis Technologies. I suggested that he review the vendor consolidation contract, specifically Clause 12.7b, before making any threats. I hung up the phone and immediately called my attorney, Diane Vance. She laughed when I told her about the conversation. She said that the company was clearly desperate and that they had no legal recourse because they had initiated the termination themselves without following the contract guidelines. That afternoon, I drafted the formal notice of license revocation. The document was written on the official letterhead of Henderson Ops Systems LLC, and it was signed and notarized by a local notary public. The letter stated that Vaxis Technologies was no longer authorized to use, deploy, or access the proprietary database architecture and API integration modules developed by my LLC. It cited Clause 12.7b of the vendor agreement, noting that the license had been revoked effective the date of my termination. I did not send the letter by email, nor did I upload it to the company portal. Instead, I hired a professional courier service to deliver physical copies of the document directly to the homes of all board members. including Lawrence Miller. I wanted them to have a tangible, legal document in their hands, one that could not be ignored or deleted. The impact of the letter was immediate. According to my sources within the company, the board of directors held an emergency meeting that evening. Lawrence was furious, demanding to know how such a clause had been included in the vendor contract. The general counsel admitted that his department had approved the document last year during the system integration phase, assuming it was a standard vendor agreement. Chloe tried to dismiss the letter as a bluff, arguing that the company could easily replace the database with an open-source alternative. The technical director, however, corrected her, pointing out that rebuilding the system from scratch would take at least 9 months and cost millions of dollars. The company did not have 9 months. They had 2 weeks before the investor presentation, and their entire product was currently not running on software they did not legally own. The board members spent the rest of the night debating their options. They knew that if they did not resolve the dispute, the funding round would collapse and the company would be forced to shut down. Lawrence wanted to offer me a settlement, but Chloe insisted they should call my bluff and proceed with the presentation. She believed that the investors would not look too closely at the technical details if the financial projections were strong. The general counsel warned her that representing the technology as proprietary without a valid license would constitute fraud, and that the consequences would be severe. The division between Lawrence and his daughter was growing, and the tension within the leadership team was reaching a breaking point. The emergency meeting ended without a clear plan. The board members were divided, and Lawrence was paralyzed by indecision. He did not want to admit that his daughter's actions had put the company in jeopardy, but he could not ignore the legal reality. The general counsel advised him that they could not legally proceed with the funding round without resolving the license issue, but Lawrence was too afraid of losing the investment. He decided to proceed with the presentation, hoping that they could negotiate a settlement with me after the deal was signed. It was a desperate plan, and one that was destined to fail. He did not understand that my attorney and I had already anticipated this move, and that we were fully prepared to file an injunction the moment the term sheet was finalized, blocking any transfer of intellectual property. The final presentation to Apex Ventures was held on the 34th floor of a skyscraper in San Francisco, overlooking the bay. The conference room was filled with executive board members and senior investment analysts. Chloe was dressed in a sharp blazer, her presentation slides loaded on the screen. She was confident, smiling at the investors and speaking about the company's strong culture and future growth projections. She did not mention the database issues or the licensing dispute, assuming that she could hide the problems until the funding was secured. She clicked through slides, showing projected revenue increases and customer retention rates, using her typical corporate vocabulary to describe our operations. I sat in the corner of the room, having been invited by Paul Mercer, the lead investor from Apex Ventures. Paul had called me the previous day, asking me to attend the meeting to verify the technical details of the platform. As Chloe reached the slide about proprietary technology, Paul Mercer held up his hand, signaling her to stop. He opened a manila folder on the table and pulled out the formal notice of license revocation I had sent to the board. He asked Lawrence if the company had resolved the licensing dispute with Henderson Ops Systems, LLC. Lawrence turned pale, looking at his daughter, who froze in mid-sentence. Chloe tried to explain that the issue was merely a minor technical dispute with a disgruntled former employee, and that their legal team was handling the matter. Paul Mercer did not accept her explanation. He read the terms of Clause 12.7b aloud, pointing out that Vaxis Technologies had terminated my services without cause, thereby revoking the license to their core infrastructure. He noted that without this license, the company did not own the software they were pitching, and that any investment would be based on vaporware. The room went completely silent as the investors realized the gravity of the situation. The general counsel sat with his head in his hands, unable to offer any defense. Lawrence tried to speak, but his voice was shaking, and he looked like he was about to collapse. Paul Mercer stood up, closing his folder and placing it in his briefcase. He looked at Lawrence and said that the deal was off, as the company had misrepresented its assets and failed to secure its technology. He thanked them for their time and walked out of the room, taking the $65 million investment off the table. The other analysts followed him, leaving the board members alone in the silent room. Chloe began to scream at the board, accusing them of failing to protect the company, but no one paid any attention to her words. The dream of the massive funding round was gone, and Vaxis Technologies was now facing bankruptcy. I stood up quietly from my chair in the corner. I had my folded company hoodie under my arm, the one Chloe had given me with my name written in marker. I walked to the door, passing the trash can near the entrance. I dropped the polyester sweater into the bin, not even pausing to look back at the room. As I walked down the hallway to the elevators, my phone buzzed with a notification. It was an email from another venture capital firm, asking if I would be open to discussing an acquisition of the proprietary database technology owned by Henderson Ops Systems, LLC. They were offering to purchase the assets on my own terms. I stepped into the elevator, feeling a deep sense of relief and satisfaction. I had built a system that protected itself, and the silence of my departure had spoken louder than any corporate slogan. As the elevator doors closed, I knew that Vaxis Technologies would not survive the month. Without the back-end license, they could not legally serve their existing clients, and the news of the failed funding round would soon spread. The board would likely force Lawrence to step down, and Chloe's brief career as a corporate executive was effectively over. I walked out of the lobby and into the warm afternoon sun, feeling the weight of the last 8 years lift from my shoulders. I was free, and I possessed the technology that they had tried so hard to take from me. I had played the long game, and the victory was far sweeter than any bonus could ever be. I walked to my car, parked along the street, and sat behind the wheel. I took a deep breath, enjoying the quiet moment before starting the engine. The corporate world had tried to reduce my value to a cheap hoodie and a minor gift card, but they had failed to realize that competence cannot be replaced by slogans or nepotism. I drove away from the city, looking forward to the future and the new opportunities that were waiting for my private LLC. The system had worked exactly as designed, and I was finally in control of my own destiny. I knew that the road ahead would be challenging, but I was confident in my ability to build a new business on my own terms. I had reclaimed my life work, and no Nepo baby could ever take that away from me again.